Tanake Harurera. My name is Brittany Schulman. I'm Wakamasuan and the Vice President of Indigenous Leadership and Education Programs here at Native Americans in Philanthropy. Native Americans in Philanthropy is working to support a more informed philanthropic sector that will strive to be in relationship with our peoples and our communities. These education sessions will be one of the offerings we'll provide to our membership in 2023. The goal of these sessions is to share topics and issues that affect our communities from those most impacted and provide an opportunity for the sector to learn and to act. Today's topic, boarding school reconciliation and philanthropy, is heavy, and we appreciate you taking the time to join. If you are in the chat, please feel free to introduce yourself and ask any questions that you may have. Questions, big and small, are how we grow together and part of the healing process. With that said, I would like to introduce my dear sister, Stephine Poston, to moderate this panel. Welcome, Steph.
Greetings, everybody, and welcome to our second convening of this education series hosted by Native Americans in Philanthropy. Really excited about the topic we have today. We have a great lineup of speakers. And with that, I'd like to have the speakers join in. Before that, again, my name is Steph Poston. I am from the Pueblo of Sandia, and I am the moderator for these the series that Native Americans in Philanthropy is hosting. So the first person I'd like to introduce is, if I could have Deborah Parker. She is the CEO, and I will have her do her introductions.
Haslahel, good day. Hello, Sitsayaltsa Sitsta. My traditional name is Sitsayaltsa. My birth name is Deborah Parker, and I'm a member of the Tulalip tribes. And I have the honor of serving as the Chief Executive Officer for the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. We are located in Minneapolis, Minnesota. So that's where I'm coming to you from. And you can see the orange shirts in the background. So we're preparing for Orange Shirt Day tomorrow, and tonight we will be doing a vigil in honor of children and the boarding school survivors, to keep them in our thoughts and our prayers. So thank you for having us.
Great, thank you. And our next panelist, I'll have Winoka Yepa come in.
Yate shike do shidene she Winoka Yepa yinishye loginishlen do batani bashichin she dashiche do toaglini dashinele. Hello everyone. My name is Winoka Yepa. I am a member of the Diné Nation and originally from Natani Nez, or what is known as Chirac, New Mexico, but I currently reside in Ogepogo, Wingay, or White Shell Water Place, also known as Santa Fe. And I am the Data and Research Associate with Native Americans in Philanthropy. And I'm also a PhD candidate in Indigenous Education and Identity Studies at the University of New Mexico, as well as founder of an Indigenous youth program called the Reflection Project. Nice to be here.
Welcome. If I could have Samuel introduce himself.
Tonalte no chime na no toca Samuel Torres, ni Mexica iwan ni Nahua na Nehuali, Los Angeles, California iwan, El Paso, Texas iwan, Zacatecas, Mexico. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Samuel Torres. I serve the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition as the Deputy Chief Executive Officer. I was hired in 2019 as the Director of Research and Programs. I originally from Los Angeles, California, where most of my family currently resides. I'm Mexica and Nahua on my father's side, with my relatives coming from Zacatecas, Mexico, as well as El Paso, Texas. And on my mother's side, I'm Irish and Scottish. My background is primarily in educational leadership. I was a classroom teacher for over a decade. And when I pursued my doctorate education in educational leadership for social justice, I published my dissertation in decolonizing Indigenous education in the United States and focusing on boarding schools as the impacts and focusing and looking at those impacts in contemporary day right now. So I'm just really honored to be here, honored to continue to support this really important work. And I'm glad to have this conversation with all the panelists and with you, Steph. So yes, thank you.
Great. Yeah, thanks for those great intros. As the audience can see, we have a panel that is full of expertise and knowledge. And I think what I love most about getting to know the panelists is the passion they have for this work. So I'm going to just give a series of questions. And the first one I'd like to call up to answer the first question is Deb Parker. So with boarding school healing in the headlines and as a hot topic discussion in the political sphere, can you share with us what is not being talked about that needs discussion?
Well, to date, we still do not have accounting of the number of children that were forced to attend the boarding schools in the United States. We do not know the number of children who were abused, died, or went missing while at these institutions. And we also, have not begun to really examine thoroughly the long-term impacts on the children, families, our communities who were, from the children who were forced to attend Indian boarding schools. So there's a lot of unknowns. We are not in the, written in the history books. We do not have legislation right now that supports the examination and the genocide that was created from the acts that included hundreds of thousands of children who were taken away from our families and who were put in boarding schools and church-run Indian boarding schools. So it was the government, churches, private industries who took our children. And so tribal nations, survivors, citizens are looking for answers. And we believe it's time that those answers come forward. We believe that the truth needs to be told and that we need to begin our healing. And absolutely, these children and family members deserve justice. So that's just the very beginning stages of where we're at right now. And so we do have a commission bill that is out right now, Senate Bill 2907 and HR 5444, which would create a Truth and Healing Commission on Indian boarding schools. And so we are working towards some legislation. We are working with survivors and families through the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. We refer to ourselves as NABS for short, but that's our work right now.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. And I just can't think of a better person but to lead that topic and to collect the data necessary to do the continued work. So thanks for that. I'd like to call on Winoka. What do you think needs to be shared with us that's not being talked about right now?
Certainly, I think for myself, and this kind of stems from a lot of the work that I do within culture and language revitalization work, as well as even within education, is the complexity of Indian boarding school history. I think within national headlines and even within local headlines, there is this narrative that is shared that suggests that every Indigenous community has had similar experiences when it comes to Indian boarding schools. When, that is not really the case. And, speaking only for my own tribal community, the boarding school history within New Mexico is a lot different than boarding school history in Oklahoma or in other places. And so I think that is something that is not often shared. And also within Western society, I feel like, especially within social channels, that people tend to feed off of trauma. And so, therefore, only the trauma of boarding schools is shared, but not often is the resilience of our Indigenous people is not often expressed. And, I mean, it's the fact that boarding schools, failed at their purpose, which is to assimilate Native people. But that is not the case. We have a lot of our cultures, our languages, our lifeways are still thriving, and then again, that's dependent on the communities as well. But I think that is something that is not often shared.
Yeah, I love the way that you frame that. You do often hear about the traumas, but we don't talk about that resiliency that came out of that. So thank you for sharing that. Samuel, what do you think needs to be shared that's not being talked about?
Well, I want to thank the other guests, the other panelists for sharing their thoughts on this, because I think I agree. I agree with both of them. But one of the things that I think needs to be understood is that before folks try to rush towards healing or even concepts and language that I think often get rushed towards like reconciliation, we have to focus on centering the truth, the experiences of what we understand over 500 boarding school institutions that we have identified in collaboration with the Department of the Interior that we have been working with for over a year now. As we saw from their Boarding School Truth Initiative, there were 408 federal boarding school institutions that were some were operated by the federal government, others were operated by private institutions, church-run institutions. But the 408 number is a designation that received funding from the government at some point. And so looking at the fact that boarding schools were the first compulsory education model in the United States brings to mind the fact that education standards, education practices, and methods that we see today still very much hold on to the legacy of boarding schools. That was the first time that the government had an education system throughout the lands that we now know as the United States. And so I think it would be a mistake to overlook the impacts of boarding schools, not just, of course, to our Native relatives, but for everyone everywhere. So this issue is, of course, front and center for our relatives, our Indigenous communities here and everywhere. But this has enormous implications for the way that schooling is even seen in general for the greater public. So I think it's really important that we really understand what the seeds of injustice, the seeds of oppression really are with this schooling model, because we're continuing to see those impacts that we know from the school to prison pipeline, impacts that we know with unjust incarceration, with tracking. And then, of course, the other thing that I think needs to be shared is that we just ultimately, particularly when it comes to boarding school issues, need to listen to Indigenous people. Folks, when they hear about this, particularly non-Native folks, when they hear about boarding school trauma for the first time, boarding school narratives for the first time, there's often a lot of big feelings, a lot of anger, maybe even guilt. But I think it's really important that we recognize that this comes from a systemic issue. This was a federal forced removal program that evolved and morphed throughout the generations. And it's no accident that the general population, the general audience, knows very little about this. This is not one of those narratives that is put together in this sort of US exceptionalist paradigm. And I think that makes it somewhat challenging to have very real conversations. So one of the things that I think is helpful is we need to be able to challenge some of those normative social common understandings of what American history looks like, because as has been said almost ad nauseum, but I think it's worth repeating, Native history is American history, and we need to include that and the stories, all of the nuanced stories, not just those that are laden in trauma, but those of resilience, as Winoka stated, those of determination, of self-determination, and those that will center the healing journeys of our relatives. So yeah, it's a long roadmap, but it's definitely worth engaging with.
Yeah, I can really appreciate the listening, and I know that your work is about that, is listening to some of these stories that have and hearing from people who have been impacted, and I think that's really powerful in and of itself. But you know, really getting to those seeds of injustice and oppression is there's so much work to be done there. Lots of work to be done. The next question I'd like to go ahead and bring up Winoka on this is, we talk about healing and revitalization efforts, but often people outside our communities don't see the full picture of what all that means. Can you help us have a better understanding of how far reaching this is, and share what you think our societies might look like today without the removal of children?
Certainly. So a lot of my background before I became a research associate for NAP was within culture and language revitalization work. A lot of that came from taking Diné language classes during the summer in Albuquerque, in which we would do these interviews with our family members, and I interviewed my mom, my grandmother, and my little sister, and learned a lot from those interviews. One thing, kind of going back to the previous question, is that there's not a lot of um, sharing of boarding school experiences within families. And I'm only kind of thinking of like um, my own history. I learned a lot about um, my family and their experiences within boarding schools just from these interviews, and being a part of these language classes. And that kind of like fed into the fact of why our language and culture was not transmitted generationally. I didn't learn anything about my language, my culture, or my life ways until I was much older. And a lot of that stemmed from the fact that, my father, my grandmother, and a lot of family members were boarding school survivors. And I didn't know that until much later in life. And maybe some of it came from the fact that I didn't, think to ask about it, and maybe around that is like, how do we find ways to talk about it within family structures? Um, but because of that, I started getting into language and cultural revitalization work. Um, One quote that I really like is from this book called The Language Warriors Manifesto. And something that a lot of my friends and I would always say is that we're language warriors. And what language warriors means is that you see the importance of your language, then you center your life around that and you lead the effort to bring it back. And so with that, um, I started learning my Diné language at a much older age. I think I was probably like 19 when I started. And because of that, I wanted to learn my language, because you can't teach language without learning it yourself. And so that was kind of the first point of what I wanted to do. And with that, after I did that, I did a lot of kind of like self-reflecting, learning my own language, learning more about my culture, spending a lot of time with my relatives who I've never really spent time with. Um, and and then from there, building, kind of like getting into this language warrior, language field of like, started doing different things of like creating different types of curriculum, working with other communities on creating curriculum for them. A lot of my master's thesis was building out a mobile app for language learning for my own community, which kind of then translated to doing that for other communities. And of course, there is like some resistance that you get from people in the community, from outside of the community, and doing that kind of work, especially when it's a whole different like education structure that you're not familiar with. And so I had to deal with that a lot too. And probably getting totally off topic because I'm just going on and on about my whole background and revitalization work. But, you know, I do that work because a lot of it relates to my own personal experiences and an understanding that within my generations, um, after me, there is like a lot of that stems from historical trauma. A lot of that comes from learned behavior. A lot of that comes from just the experiences that our family had to deal with. I mean, mine comes from the fact that I am a descendant of boarding school survivors, and not knowing that until later in life, and then realizing that with other peers of mine. And that's the reason why, and that's not the only reason why, but why culture and language is not exchanged, especially within my generation. Um, Especially coming from living on the reservation and knowing that a good percentage of the people that I surrounded myself with all like went to Nananzat boarding school, all went to Shiprock boarding school, all went and came from boarding schools within the Navajo Nation, and all had similar experiences but different as well. And so, yeah, I mean, sharing what you and then the last question of what do you think our society might look like today without the removal of children? I mean, I'm not sure. I think like our our language and culture, I think, would be as stronger now as it, um, was before. I mean, there are also a lot of things too that we have to think about in that, our societies are ever changing. Technology is being ingrained. There are more things that are changing within our society, and those also have an effect of how we learn things, do things, and whatnot. I mean, even if boarding schools was not, something, um, was not a thing, there are other things within our society that would change the way we learn language, change the way that we think and whatnot. And so I don't know. I don't know if I have a very good answer for that.
It's okay. No. And I really appreciate it. Like you could tell you've just been in it, experiencing it. And my mother is 82 years old and she was a product of boarding school. And I know she tells a story about when she spoke her language, they were punished. But you just prompted me, like, that's about the depth of our discussion. Like, I want to be more curious when I'm with her about to ask her to tell me more about that and what that looked like. So thank you for prompting me, because next time I spend time with my mom, that's certainly, I'm going to be more curious about that. I'd like to ask Samuel, like, about this, like what we talk about the healing and revitalization efforts, but outside our communities, we don't see the full picture, what that is about. How far reaching is this?
I really appreciate the words of Winoka. I think having that, the perspective of healing is so vital, of course, within our communities, but we, I think, need to recognize that boarding schools were seen as a federal policy that was a shift from overt extermination of all indigenous people to gain Indian land, to gain more territory for settlers. And so I think beyond the impacts, I mean, though they are very important, but beyond the impacts, the direct impacts, violent, physical, spiritual, sexual, emotional abuse that boarding schools included, boarding schools were seen as kind of like that philanthropic shift towards indigenous people from the settler colonial perspective. And so I think one of those consequences of that kind of fundamental disposition towards indigenous peoples is that it's still very much alive. These facets of white supremacy and racism, toxicities that, I think it's very easy for the unexamined folks in our societies to state that, well, racism is over because of X, Y, and Z, or white supremacy is not something that we need to deal with because of these factors. But it's the very fabric of the unfolding consciousness and the political apparatuses of the United States as a settler nation. And so that's something that we still have to contend with. We can work on healing as much as we can in our communities. And I just want to borrow the words of our board president, Sandy Whitehawk, who's Si Changu Lakota. She is a brilliant leader, and she mentions that we have the knowledge to be able to heal ourselves. We have the ceremonies. We know what it is we need to do. But the caveat is, when we are always constantly trying to survive, when we don't have the resources to be able to do the things that we know we need to do, it makes that healing very difficult to do. So it is about addressing those economic, those social and political inequities. And it's also about being able to reckon with that past of white supremacy that is still very much something that we all have to deal with in our societies today. I think if and when those major factors, resources, and the historical context of white supremacy within settler nations and settler states, I think that opens the doors for really meaningful healing. Outside of that, of course, healing is happening. I think anytime we have conversations with our relatives, similarly, I did not start learning my language until I was in my 20s. And so I'm still working on that. I have an 8-year-old daughter who will not be able to share the same thing that I am sharing with you right now. She's being raised in her language. She's being raised with her dances, with her songs, rituals, and ceremonies. And that's something that we know is medicine for me and my family, for us as a people collectively. But we got to recognize that there are also some really deep roots to the injustices that continue to have very distinct impacts. And once those are addressed, and justice is seen in a really big way, then we can actually engage really meaningful healing in our communities and in our nations.
Yeah. Just that second part of the question, I want to keep you on screen here, is if you could share with us what you think our societies might look like today without the removal of our children?
That's a tough one, I think, because of course it beckons the imagination, right? The creative imagination required to go through that, because we're still seeing forced removal of our children, necessitating the Indian Child Welfare Act, which of course is something that we're all concerned about, considering the actions of the Supreme Court and hearing Holland versus Brackeen. I think that's coming up again. But we know that in other instances throughout the world that genocides that occur are generally target children. And so to imagine what life would be like for our relatives without a genocide that targets our children is one that I think beckons a creative and liberatory imagination, one that we can actually, I think, is an important exercise. And I'm glad it's a question that you brought up, because it's a reality that we can work toward, right? Mm-hmm. Our children are our seeds, and in my traditional ways, there are seeds. There are seeds of corn. There are precious stones, and they carry the sacred knowledge and traditions that have been passed down to us, and it's our responsibility to pass it down to them. So it's a very emotional and spiritual labor, I think, to think of it in that way, because we have been wounded by boarding schools. We have been wounded by the nefarious means of settler colonialism and oppression. And so to imagine a world where our children are walking in a way that we ourselves wish we could have been walking, I think we are starting to see that. But I think our nations would be stronger. I think our people, our languages, our cultures would be I would say like a moral model for the world, to be able to see in a profound way. We already are doing that, but it would be an incredible movement to be able to not have to rebuild from the ashes, so to speak. And it's kind of what we're in a place right now, because we're still fighting for our children, despite ICWA being in place. We still have to fight to make sure that ICWA can continue to be in place. And the roots of that are really in boarding schools, because the boarding school model was the first U.S. Indian child welfare policy, that of forced removal and of assimilation.
Great, thank you for that insight. I want to go to Deb Parker on the same question about we talk about the healing and revitalization efforts, but often people outside of our communities don't see the full picture of what that looks like. Can you help us have a better understanding of how far-reaching this is?
Well, absolutely. Thank you for that question. And the other panelists have shared some deep knowledge there that is important to listen to. It is important to understand the U.S. history and policies that are not taught in public education, not in history books. So there's some legal frameworks that I think it's important to bring out, and that includes the boarding school era and the policies of the forced assimilation. And so as we begin to examine those policies and look at the goal, which was to kill the Indian to save the man, and again, like Dr. Torres stated, they did that through, the U.S. government did that through the taking of Indian children. And so what's the impact of when you take a child away from their mother's arms and their father's, and you send them to boarding school somewhere down the road, but as we've seen on my reservation, from Tulalip tribes, children, we actually had a boarding school in Tulalip, and many of our children were sent far away, like to Oklahoma, to Texas, and other locations. Why? Why would someone do that? Why would government officials come and take children and send them to faraway locations? And so as we begin to look at our own histories, what happened to my grandmothers, what happened to our family members, we begin to see that there's some broken pieces and some stories untold. And we begin to see that when those children were taken away, what we're not looking at as what happened to the mothers and fathers who had their 5-year-olds taken, their 6-year-olds. I have a 12-year-old. Someone came and took my 12-year-old? I don't know what I would do. You would think you would fight like hell to get your children back, and our families do. But when the law is against you, when the public has information, then they believe that Native people are not worthy of raising their own children, of worthy of continuing our practices, our spiritual practices, because they were looked upon, frowned upon as demonic, as we're heathens. Every negative thing you can think of to eradicate a people, that's what we were called. Our children, my father, our grandparents were so demeaned. They were called stupid. They were, and for many of, like, such as my father, he had a sort of a list. So they said that he's needs special classes, and he said, I don't know, this is how we talk, and that was our Lashutsi language. Somos, we're Stohobsh people, and so that was the goal of the government. That was the goal of settlers who came and wanted to make sure that we believed that we're not worthy. We're not worthy of caring for our lands. We're not worthy of living the life that we're meant to, as for me, as Stohobsh people, as a traditional sacred way of life, hunting and caring and supporting our children, nurturing. And so I believe with broken hearts, when our kids were taken, our communities really grieved. We really had a difficult path forward. And we wonder now why our grandmas and grandfathers, why they're silent. Well, if you remember the stories which we hear here at the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition, we hear stories that I don't know how people have continued in the way that they have, because when your mouth is washed out with soap, when you're chained to heaters in basements, when you're slapped, hit, punched, knocked down, how do you get back up, especially if you're a child? And especially if you have no one else to go to and you're in a boarding school, it's overcrowded. There's not enough food often. And so you believe that you're not worthy of anything more. And so that's what we're looking at is these our elders today who have been told these stories, and we've been left out of the history. And it's so important. And people ask, why today? Well, today is important because our families matter, our children matter. And so that's our goal, is to get back to that place of balance, of harmony, of unity, of prayer, of bringing back our traditional medicines. So, and part of that is the most sacred gift that we have is our children, is taking care of our children and finding those healthy spaces for us to exist, to coexist with others who came to these lands.
Yeah, such a powerful way to describe, and just that whole feeling of having a 12-year-old son, or my boys, they're older now, but that's just horrifying, right? Put yourself in those spots and think through the damage and the trauma that was caused. So I appreciate you sharing that with us. I just want to acknowledge there's some comments coming from the audience. Ed.D, he's saying, I am glad you all are addressing this issue. We were made to feel ashamed to be who we are. I hope that we can at least change the history books for all to learn what the European settlers have done to our people through the fear of God. Let's change that also. So the audience is, I also want to go to audience question from Hanali, and if I mispronounce it, my apologies. But I'm going to ask Winoka the question. Public school teaches different subject matter than private schools. How can we start a tribal school, public school, open to indigenous nations only, like they did in the Kamehameha schools? I believe that's a Hawaiian school.
I'm sorry, Steph, I couldn't really hear you, but
I can repeat the question. Is this better?
no, but I think I know what question you're referring to.
Okay.
Yes. So the question is, public school teaches different subject matter than private schools. How can we start a tribal school, public schools open to indigenous nations only, like they did with the Kamehameha schools? Yeah, so there are actually a few tribal schools that I have worked with in the past that are all located near or on the Navajo Nation, and I'm pretty sure Samuel and Deborah may have some that they would like to share as well. And so for me, I think about Diné School, which is an elementary school, and focused on the Navajo language and culture, as well as the Star School, which is located near, I believe it's Flagstaff, Arizona. And they focus a lot on culture and lifeways and sustainability. And those are some of the schools. They're majority Native American, majority Navajo students. And I point to those two schools because a lot of them are immersion focused. And when it comes to immersion, it's in language and culture. A lot of their schools are taught in the Diné language. And a lot of the subjects that they teach are, within Diné philosophies and epistemologies. And so those are some of the schools that I'm familiar with. And there are so many others that are throughout the country that are tribal schools, that are charter schools, that focus on indigenous language, indigenous culture, indigenous epistemologies. But those are two that I like to point out because those are two that I am very familiar with and always like to amplify and share out to the public.
Thank you so much, Winoka. And just, there are definitely places to look, just to address that question really quickly. Thank you for asking. And that we know that there are not just tribal nations who are working to provide these schools. They're also coming in different urban areas, such as the Native American Community Academy in Albuquerque, which is, for all intents and purposes, an urban a place for urban natives to have those conversations, to be able to see themselves reflected in the curriculum, which I think is super important. And I also wanted to jump back to another audience comment. I'm glad, this is from Ed.D. Breen. I'm glad you're addressing this issue. We've been made to feel ashamed to be who we are. I hope that at least change the history books for all to learn what the European settlers have done to our people through the fear of God. Let's change that also. And then also with Gwen Carr, traumatized children have very deep abandonment issues and a host of other dysfunctions. I think you can draw a direct line to MMIW, substance abuse, and other trauma-based issues in our people today. And that's part of the reason for this conversation, to be able to talk about the healing and also bring in that truth and how it is connected to some of the other issues that we face and that we are moving beyond. Even though we're not there yet. I just want to slide into our next question, which is really directed toward Samuel. If you'll share a little bit of the ongoing advocacy efforts that you're working on and supporting.
Absolutely. And I'm honored by Deborah kind of alluding to it, but we're currently advocating a bill that we helped write in the Truth and Healing Commission bill on Indian Boarding School Policies Act. That's House Resolution 5444 and Senate Bill 2907. And we find these to be a really important step in centering truth and accountability. And not rushing towards what I think we were talking about earlier, reconciliation, or just like putting healing on Indigenous people. Like, y'all need to get over this, right? Because this is something that is going to take a lot of fundamental social and political transformation, something that a commission has the possibility of being able to bring the leaders, the thinkers, boarding school survivors, the Indian organizations that have been doing this work for generations, to be able to finally have some recognition from the federal government that systematized boarding schools in the first place, to be able to have a meeting of the minds, to be able to come up with recommendations not too dissimilar from the Canadian Truth and Reconciliation Commission, whose final report, which was published in 2015, held 94 calls to action in addressing this path towards what they would refer to as reconciliation. I think that these commissions are certainly, not an end all be all, but it's definitely the next wave in the place that we need to go as a society. We had an advocacy event not too long ago, just a couple of weeks ago. We kicked off a campaign that we're calling 7 Weeks of Action for 7 Generations, where we're calling on all audiences everywhere to help support by having phone calls being directed towards congressional leaders, congressional offices everywhere. As we know, folks that we elect into office, they listen to these phone calls, they listen to these emails, and as metrics go, if there are a certain amount of phone calls that are placed in a particular week, that issue gets attention. So if we can get even 10 phone calls in one office per week, that is substantive. That really helps us move this message forward. This commission bill has the possibility for not just bringing people together, but having culturally appropriate, culturally sensitive hearing processes for survivors. It has the possibility of being able to locate, analyze, even potentially digitize boarding school records that exist both in the public domain, in archives like the National Archives and Records Administration, which there are facilities across the country that do that, as well as the opportunity, or the possibility rather, of being able to obtain records from private institutions as well. And I think an important distinction right there is the power for a committee in the commission to be able to subpoena records if they're maybe not cataloged, or they don't have appropriate resources or personnel to be able to do that. Oftentimes those legal parameters are necessary to invoke to be able to get these records to come to the surface. Again, we're talking about over 500 institutions, and so situations are going to be different from across the board, but a commission is a great starting place for folks to be able to come together and to be able to put out a series of recommendations like the Canadian Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So if we can put in the chat a link to some of our advocacy efforts for the Truth Commission, it's boardingschoolhealing.org/Truth Commission. And then we have a one-pager, a beautiful toolkit with phone numbers, with sample scripts that you can use when you're making phone calls, sample letter templates, a lot of really great resources that is very, very accessible that can allow folks to be able to, if you haven't done, outreach to congressional offices before, it's a great step-by-step process to be able to guide you through that. And we're calling on everyone everywhere to be able to help us support this process. And we really believe that this bipartisan bill, essentially, which is what it is a powerful way to be able to actually center truth and accountability so that healing can take place.
Thank you so much, Samuel. And I just also wanted to address the chat real quickly. Catherine Parker asked, I'm an Indigenous retired teacher. How can we help with the issues that we are talking about today? And I think Samuel just laid out a really good opportunity, a really good path forward for anyone who's looking to help, who's looking to support. We know that as tribes or nations, and that nation-to-nation agreement is important, especially as we're speaking to Congress and our senators on the issues that are at hand. And I just want to pass it back to Deb if there was any other opportunities of ongoing advocacy that you're working on supporting. I know that one's a huge one. So thank you, Sam.
Yes, absolutely. Across the nation, as we understand tomorrow to be an Orange Shirt Day, folks are gathering and sharing songs, traditional songs, dances, ceremonies, reaching out to relatives, letting them know that they love them, that they truly care for them, and that their lives matter. And that is so important during this day and time, is to connect with our Indigenous relatives and to build that movement of trust, that movement of caring for one another and uplifting each other. Now's the time to begin to connect with Indigenous peoples and listen carefully, listen and embrace, and not seek to change, but just simply be present in the lives of our Indigenous peoples. And so I think, advocacy is very much being present. It's very much reaching out to one another. Sam mentioned our boardingschoolhealing.org. Become a coalition member, and you can join us and be a part of some of our activities that we have nationally. And so we're at conferences, we're educating as much as possible. We just in Tulalip at the Affiliated Tribes of Northwest Indians, we did a healing circle, and we were scheduled for 2 hours. It turned out to be 4 hours. And during the 4 hours, there was not a dry eye in the room. The amount of trauma, the amount of hurt, and also the resiliency. I'm glad that was brought up, is that we have continued past all of these hardships, really, and all of these unknown answers. Like, where's my relative? What happened to my uncle? What happened to my great grandmother? And there's so many children that disappeared. They were stolen. They were given away to other non-Indigenous families. So these are all questions that we have, and we have that missing pieces growing up in public school systems. That history is not taught. So we wonder how come we're not in the history books as Indigenous peoples? And we know we have there's treaty rights, but we also our language and our way of life surpass those treaties. And so how do we hold ourselves accountable? How do we invite others into this circle is a question that we should be asking wherever we are at, on these lands, on these sacred lands. Ask the communities, find out where tribal nations are located, reach out to tribal centers and to elders and folks. Try to understand what their story is and be patient, because this has been a long history of silence and of pain, and we have a lot to share still, a lot of beauty, a lot of our traditional stories and sacred ceremonies, and just our Indian humor. So if you watch Reservation Dogs, you see a little bit of that Indian humor. So there's so many gifts that we have as Indigenous peoples that we really can bring a lot of light and love into this world and back into this back to the lands in which we come from.
Great. So Native Americans in Philanthropy is really creating this space so that you all on the ground doing the work. And I'll ask this to Samuel, what is it that your organization might need from philanthropy to make sure your work is supported properly with the resources that, or whatever else you might need to get the work done?
That's a really good question, and one that I think seldom gets the airtime, because, you know, for us, the most important thing is the work, and to be able to be as supportive and available and eager to work in community and to put together these programs and offerings as effectively and as best we can. But as we know, that oftentimes keeping the wheels moving and making sure that we have, you know, can keep the lights on and have the personnel and the staffing to be able to carry out the ambitious goals that we have, such as, you know, I've kind of alluded to it. One of our goals is to build a first of its kind, it's never happened before, a central digital repository that we're calling the National Indian Boarding School Digital Archive, to be able to house digitized records from all 509 plus boarding school institutions that were in existence, you know, in the boarding school policy era. And that's a huge, formidable task in and of itself. And we are working with other partners throughout the country that have done this kind of project for a specific school. But we are aiming to bring the minds together, bring those resources together to make these resources available for tribes, for individuals and communities to be able to learn more about what happened to, you know, their relatives, for educators to be able to utilize these resources in a way that is not currently seen at all, really, to be honest with you, in classrooms. In fact, there's only 5 states in the country that even have a state content standard that mentions boarding schools at all. And that doesn't even really guarantee that they're doing a great job of teaching boarding schools, if at all. It's maybe a day on, you know, September 30th or Native American Heritage Month, something to that degree, still very marginalized and dichotomized, not really ingrained in an entire education, meaningful education experience. But all of these efforts require resources. We do have very strong relationships with organizations that, you know, we have grant agreements with, and fortunately, some of them are general operating grant awards and grant monies, and those are the ones that really we're so grateful for. We're grateful for all of it, to be honest with you, but those are the ones that allow us the greatest flexibility to continue focusing on that work. We have a proposal, a general proposal that right now that we have been sharing with a lot of potential funders and partners, a 2-year, $1 million proposal to digitize resources and to integrate the digitization process to create a sustainable healing circle model that would invite elders and residents, hire a director of healing programs, and work with individuals and communities that want to have more of these conversations, that want to share their lived histories and stories. And as we know, talking about it can be very therapeutic and can be very important to initiate meaningful healing. but it can't be done just with anybody, right? We know the secondary trauma and even the primary trauma that can happen with talking to a therapist that doesn't understand the historical foundations of boarding schools, of systemic oppression in general. And so we are focusing on working towards making these materials, integrating archival materials, and working with a healing programs director to be able to put together a sustainable 2-year model right now, and then to create something beyond that. And so we just are looking for building those partnerships, building those bridges, and then also in bringing in the leadership and the ideas and the input from some of our the relationships that we have with some of these organizations. We've found that these organizations are much deeper than just the transaction of a check, right? It's important to us that the organizations and the philanthropies that we work with, they believe in our mission, that they understand that what we're doing is part of a greater growing fabric to create a better society. And so it's a big ask, but we're looking for long-term sustainable partnerships. And we're grateful for the ones we have, but we know that we can always grow our mission. There's so much work, and with the work comes a demand for personnel and resources, and ultimately the time to do this really and to engage these ambitious goals.
Yeah, thanks. I know you and Deb work for the same organization, but did you have anything else that you want to put out there where you might need? What are some? What does the organization need for philanthropy people to better support the reconciliation?
I think Sam covered that very well. I think I would add absolutely staffing is needed. We need some additional policy staff to help educate Congress, because that's a large work. A large part of our work is educating folks on what the boarding school era included: the loss of land, the identity, language, and the harm that was created to our children, which in effect created that intergenerational trauma. And so we have a large amount of work to undertake, and we have survivors who are now coming forward, often for the first time. So therapeutic services, healing. As Sam mentioned, we are looking to hire a healing director because we get quite a few calls into our main office here, and folks are looking for that piece of healing, that piece of what do I do now that my stories are coming out? How do we heal?
Yeah. Winoka, you're with Native Americans in Philanthropy. Like, to your colleagues, who also work in philanthropy, what can they do to better support reconciliation?
I think speaking on for my organization, but speaking for organizations that I once supported within language and culture, and even within the arts, I think, there needs to be more mutual accountability that needs to exist. There needs to be relationship building, rooted in trust, rooted in transparency. I also feel that it is, a funder's responsibility to get to know the issues, and get to know the organization itself. I mean, I think for myself, when I'm often asked to be a grant reviewer for different types of grants related to my background. And one thing I always bring up is that funders really need to reevaluate their criteria and requirements, because most of their criteria are usually, giving presence to more established, more well-funded organizations. And it's, in my perspective, a power move. And so that is something that, I always bring up, is, how can you create like requirements and criteria, that is more related to the work that these work that these organizations are doing and what matters to them the most. Like what Samuel said, the work is priority. The work is the most important thing. And so I think that is something to really think about, as well as even unrestricted funding. That is something that we talk about here at NAP, is that, giving unrestricted funding, to allow organizations to allocate, resources where they are needed, where the organization prioritizes it, and I think that funders need to do that, as well as, and then also just being more responsive and adaptive, I think that's most important. I always go back to accountability and reciprocity, relationship building. I think those definitely matter between the funder and who they are organized, who are they supporting, I mean, it can't just be throwing money at something. There needs to be more than that, for sure.
Yeah, no, thanks. That was really insightful. I really like the idea of it's just looking at the requirements and the criteria, so that opens the door. That's something folks can go back to their organizations and make change there immediately. So thank you for that thoughtful response, Winoka. I really like this next question. Building equity and philanthropy is vital to the work we all do, but it can look differently to all of us. And oftentimes philanthropy it's changing, and it's moving toward this trust-based giving. So would you share with us why you think trust-based giving is especially important in boarding school reconciliation? Deb, I'll ask you that question.
Yes, that's a great question. If you hear some sounds in the background, Lieutenant Governor of Minnesota Peggy Flanagan just arrived in our building. So there's so much excitement whenever we receive visitors here at NABS who support our work. And so just if they're screaming in the background, there's a lot of fans there.
Totally understandable.
So the question about sustainability and
trust-based giving.
And pardon?
The trust-based giving.
Trust-based giving, absolutely. The Candida Foundation awarded us a nice amount of funding so that we are able to do the work that we need to. And a lot of that was, I'm looking on my desk. We have, I'm gonna reach over here. We have some sage here. So we're harvesting, we're getting traditional medicines sustainably so that we can do our healing. And so where would you find that in a grant? Where would you locate that? We have T-shirts and gifts for survivors who are speakers, who we want to acknowledge them and gift them. And oh my gosh, would you mind if I would love to introduce, I don't know, for those of you who don't know, this is Lieutenant Governor Peggy Flanagan. So we're super excited.
Lieutenant Governor Flanagan, welcome. So exciting. This is how it all happens, and we appreciate all the support you give, and so excited to have you appear on our virtual connection here.
Well, I'm so happy to be here and to support the incredible work of NABS. It's so powerful, and just all of these, the board, these women, this leader right here, doing the healing work for our people. I'm so grateful for you. So I just came to give you this, and then I'm gonna go.
Wow.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
She's
Bye.
live from Minneapolis, from the NABS office.
I love it. I love that impromptu guest visitor. What a treat we had. Thank you.
Yeah, so you can see medicines as we share our medicines, and the way we communicate, the way we gather with food and tradition, and bringing our elders from remote villages. We have two of our Alaska Native board members who flew a long way, husband and wife, to be here with us today. So it's about taking care of our elders, taking care of each other, and that's very unique that you don't often see in funding streams. And so it's, again, we need to come together. We need resources and supports for us to just unite and to share our stories. We need larger conferences. I know boarding school survivors would like to come together and to heal together and share in their experiences. So that's what we're hoping to support in the future. And that's why funding and support is so critically needed. We're so critically underfunded. So
yeah. Thanks. So I'd like to pass that question to Winoka. Would you share with us why you think trust-based giving is especially important in boarding school reconciliation?
So I think it kind of goes back to, what I just mentioned, in the last question. Trust-based giving is, rethinking how funders give to these types of organizations, and a lot of that stems in the importance of this issue, and how it is important to the people who, are really advocating for this particular issue. And it goes back to, bringing in the community, and sharing, having the community share, with these funders of how best to support this, learning more about this issue, learning more of how it is important to our communities. There are so many, there are so many different, things. And like the one most important too is, the funding initiative, giving unrestricted funding. I think it goes back to that as well. But I can't, I always say putting the organization first. The organization is the most important. They're the ones that know the most. It's important to them. It's important to, make sure that they are included in every aspect of it as well, especially the communities that they serve too.
Great. Thank you, Winoka. And what are your thoughts, Sam, on the trust-based giving aspect?
Yes, thank you for giving me the opportunity to respond to that question, because so many great ideas have been flowing. But I think that trust-based giving is right in line with the unrestricted grant parameters, limiting those really rigid parameters and compliance measures that can often really create quite an obstacle with the work that we're trying to do. We recognize, so we have a variety of different grant relationships. Some are more along the lines of unrestricted and trust-based within that model. Others are definitely more kind of like the federal and the state grant models are a little bit more burdensome. And of course, we understood those things going into it. Oftentimes, those are the ones that we know we are eligible for and are good for. But if we were all in restricted grant, relationships and had to just spend so much of our time with compliance paperwork and reporting, and every nickel and dime has to be justified and apportioned in a line item, which of course we have, the capacity to do that. It just takes a lot of time, and it would not be unreasonable to, conjecture that more than half our time could be caught up in just doing compliance paperwork and doing reporting and updates. And that's not doing this work in a good way. I think so much of the goals that NABS has always had, but particularly, in this time working with Deb in the moment, in the movement that the boarding school healing is in right now, where NABS is right now, we are honestly really seeking to try to decolonize our operations, to decolonize our way of building community with the resources, with the knowledge, with the research, with the people power that we have. Edgar Villanueva has, I think, a compelling read out there, Decolonizing Wealth, and talks about this a lot. It's right in line with that. And I'll go a step further, and I know he does too. These allow us the opportunity to really indigenize our work. And, you know, I noticed that sage. I harvested that sage. I know that sage that that Deb brought up there is right on the desk there. That's something that we know. We want that personal touch to be able to make sure that when we're working in community, people recognize the work that we're doing, that this isn't just another nonprofit or NGO or an organization that is going through the motions. This is our life's work. We are doing this because we believe in this. We are doing this because this is for our families. We're doing this because this is for our ancestors, for those that will come after us. This is not just a single generation. And I'll call back to that advocacy event for 7 weeks of action that we had 2 weeks ago. I wanted to quote NIHB CEO Stacy Boland, who said, boarding schools was over 100 years of pointed policy towards indigenous erasure, towards the extermination of our cultures and our language. It's going to take that long, just as long, to be able to put us back on the place where we could have been. Going back to your question of what would it have looked like if forced removal wasn't a part of our history? Well, we have to be committed to this change taking generations. And it's not going to be one commission that's going to do it. It's not going to be one grant project that does it. But we know that when we put this movement together, when we put these efforts together, we will be on that path to indigenize our future. And in order to indigenize our future, it's really important for us to try to decolonize our operations, to try to decolonize the way in which things have gone before. We can rethink these ways. And if we can do that, we can move forward more quickly. We can be more effective with the resources that are put in front of us. And we can really help those boarding school survivors that are still in our lives right now. This is a really critical moment. And if we can put that together, our communities will be stronger.
Wow. Such a powerful statement. Thank you. I'm going to take another question we got from the audience, and that's from Andre Jacobs. And the question is, America's 250th anniversary is upcoming in 2026. Any thoughts on the appropriate way to grapple with historical trauma during the 2024 to 2027 commemorative period? It looks like Deb is anxious to answer that, so I'll have her answer that question.
Thank you. Yes, we just had another board member show up, and then some. We had some bird song that was sang in the background. So when Sam was mentioning decolonizing the workplace, we have song. There's smudge often in the air to help cleanse our energies and our spirits to help us do this work. Because that's what it will take, is a whole new generation of compassion and understanding and ultimately a healing. And so as we look at what can we expect for the next generation? Oh, wow. And this is all real time. This staff would like to show you. We just received a proclamation, and this proclamation is a day of remembrance for the children who died while attending United States Indian boarding school. And it's signed by the governor of Minnesota and the Secretary of State.
Wow.
So this is just today. It was just right now breaking. And that's why Lieutenant Governor Peggy Flanagan is here. So these are the steps. This is what's needed, is the acknowledgement and the work and finding a way to be human. And it's humanity, holding ourselves accountable, whether you're a government official or a member of a church, a clergy, or just a citizen of your nation. It's how do we hold ourselves accountable for learning and understanding the history of our people, the culture, our language. How do we find that healing? And it's going to take a lot of work in this nation to do so. And so how do we commemorate? And I think that it's going to be coming together with leaders of this country, both elected officials, as well as our cultural and traditional spiritual people. And I think that that's a piece that's really missing in this movement, is bringing back the healers, is bringing back the mothers, the grandmothers, our elders. Those are the center of who we are. And so that's what we need to commemorate. That's how we need to bring those words forward. And it doesn't need to be complex, but it can be simple in the way that we just speak from our hearts, that we speak from that place in which we come from, and all of it. And for us, we come from these sacred lands here as Indigenous peoples, as Alaska Natives, as Native Hawaiians. These are our lands. We have sacred responsibility, and I think that sacred traditional responsibility needs to come back to the surface. And that's how we commemorate a new time and a new day, is when we come together as one.
Wow. Yeah, I just want to make sure our audience knows that what a special treat we've had all along to see the work happening live and in the background, and Deb navigating all of that, and for us to see the proclamation like fresh off the press. Just all very, this is why I love working in Indian country. This is why I love our tribal communities, because, you know, we could be on Zoom 1 minute, but, and communicating with somebody who needs our support the next. And I just have loved every moment of watching all the live action behind you, Deb. So thank you for that. Appreciate it. I want to pose a question to Winoka about how we grapple with an appropriate way to the historical trauma during that 2024-27 commemorative period. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think for me, I think a lot of it is just supporting the work that is currently being done, the work that is being done by Samuel, by Deborah, by, you know, other collectives, other groups, other organizations, you know, that are doing this work. I mean, and it, you know, not only focused in on boarding schools, but focused in on so many other different, you know, Indigenous issues, from missing and murdered Indigenous relatives to, you know, body sovereignty to, you know, finding healing spaces for people that are, you know, that are having to deal with sexual violence or domestic violence. You know, there are so many organizations that are doing phenomenal work. And I think, and a lot of, you know, a lot of those things, from substance abuse to missing or Indigenous relatives to domestic violence, all stem from historical trauma, you know? And so I think it's important to support the work that a lot of these groups are doing, you know, and also looking into their resources, I think, is very important as well. I mean, shouting out one of our New Mexico-based groups, which is an all Native woman group, Pueblo Action Alliance. You know, they have workshops that they do for the youth and that they do for other Indigenous relatives that create healing spaces, you know, for Indigenous relatives to heal, you know, and create ways of empowerment. You know, I think those spaces are very important as well. And so, yeah.
Great. So as we wrap up, I just want to go around the room and see if anybody has any final remarks. And Samuel, I'll start with you. Any final remarks to share with the audience?
Yeah, thank you for this incredible panel first. A lot of credit and just gratitude for Native Americans in Philanthropy for wanting to put this webinar on. It's good to be connected to you all wherever you may be. We just encourage you all to stay active, to be connected with us, with your communities, with your regional committees or communities that are working on boarding school healing. As a national advocacy organization, really, we strive to be a coalition, a source of support, resources for folks. We also want to share that we're not a huge organization. We have 10 full-time staff members, and we are eager to expand our capacity as much as we can. We get so many requests to be able to be in community, to be able to do presentations, to do education, to hold healing spaces, to utilize and lean on the leaders and the healers and the support people in folks' community. Even though we are a healing coalition and our healing is literally in our name, we've never, ever had the inclination or the feeling that we're going to go into a community and tell folks what it needs to take to heal. We know that we have that within ourselves and within our communities and within our ceremonies. But one thing that we want to do is be able to just, be a source of strength to help empower folks that we hold that medicine. The resources are another thing, right? But we know that when we are leaning in and supporting each other through the various ways that we can, either financially, through the knowledge that we hold, through the ceremonies that we are aiming to pass down, that we can be stronger together. Please sign up to be a member for us at the very least. It's the easiest, the best way of being connected to us. And, this is a critical moment. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, boarding school survivors, they're still with us. Our relatives that experience some of the worst horrors that can be imagined are still with us and are feeling those impacts. And so we have a critical time right now that we're not going to get back. In just a short generation from now, the opportunities that we'll have to recollect this time will be through the perspective of descendants, which is important, right? That's still very important, but we still have to recognize that this is something that we're living with. We have boarding school survivors to support right now. And so we just really need the resources to be able to expand that capacity, because there is not one Native person on these lands that have not been impacted and affected by boarding schools. And so with that, we know that the reach is large. And so we are seeking the support to be able to expand our capacity to try to meet that as best we can.
Great. Thank you. Deb, any last thoughts?
Yes, I would ask, can we have, or I would like to introduce Kenrick Escalante, who's our creative director, and ask if we can, he can honor us with a song and just ask for that healing for today and for our future work.
I love that.
Okay, thank you.
Bring them on.
As we talk about decolonizing, this is
Yes,
the office.
Let's do it.
Yes, all right.
All right.
I'll switch.
Oh, Kendra.
I know him.
Iwahot kamadum venti v'mai tevitz kutsan imamulik Kenrick Escalante Medican imamulik. It's my pleasure to sing this song to remind you that we are the stewards of our land, and that's what this song represents. This is a lightning song from my lands of Arizona. So thank you. Amor, año ay, amate 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 amor, año ay. Iwahot na yunha.
Harkem. I appreciate that. It's beautiful. Thank you so much. Wow. Very powerful. Thank you you just keep bringing on the beautiful gifts for us today. I love it. Thank you so much. Winoka, did you have any closing thoughts?
I mean, I think we just ended this session beautifully. And so I just wanted to thank you for inviting me to be a part, of this session. It was great to share space with both Samuel and Deborah. Your work is absolutely amazing, and I'm just very grateful, to be in your presence and to learn more about the work that you're doing. It's phenomenal and beautiful. And thank you so much to Stephanie and to everyone at NAP.
Yeah. Today I was just, like I just said, was just full of gifts and really touched my heart in so many ways. To be amongst these thought leaders, you each are just leaders in what you're doing for our people. So from the bottom of my heart, I thank you and appreciate you participating in this panel. And at this point, I will turn it over to Brittany.
I just want to say hello, thank you all so much. Thank you, Steph. Thank our panelists, Deb, Samuel, and Winoka. Also, thank you to our special guests, Lieutenant Governor Peggy Flanagan for the proclamation and Kenrick Escalante for the song. I just want to point back to something that was said at the very beginning of this broadcast. Without truth, there is no healing. And so I want to thank everyone who joined us today, hearing truths you may not have heard before, really receiving it, really receiving the discussion, the healing. And thank you to those who shared in the chat and for your process in continuing your own learning. To find out more about supporting our panelists or donating, please make sure you visit boardingschoolhealing.org. That'll definitely be listed down below, right here below me. Also, remember you'll be receiving an evaluation. Please take time to share your thoughts. They really help us. It only takes about 3 minutes, and we want to make sure that we're improving these type of events as we're continuing to provide education in different aspects. Thank you all for joining us for the session, and we will see you at our next one. Hello.